Lansu Chinese Garden is celebrating 25 years of culture, community, and connection this September. If you haven't been, it's the gem of the historic Old Town Chinatown neighborhood. And now is the perfect time to discover why Lansu is more than a garden. They're inviting everyone to help them celebrate their milestone with discounted admission, cultural performances, historical exhibits, and so much more. You can go to lansugarden.org for more details. That's LANSU garden.org. As we trudge along looking for solutions to our city's ongoing housing crisis, many experts agree denser housing is the key. But historically, the single-family home has had a nearly tyrannical hold on Portland neighborhoods. You ever wondered why? Well, today on CityCast Portland, we're revisiting a conversation I had with urban planner and author Max Podemski. He wrote the book A Paradise of Small Houses, which looks at how distinctive housing types have evolved according to the geography, climate, population, and culture of individual cities. And he has a whole chapter dedicated to talking about Portland. Get ready for some controversial takes on one of the most beloved architectural styles found in our city, the Portland Bungalow. It's Monday, August 25th. I'm Claudia Meza, and this is what Portland's talking about. You know, you opened the book describing your grandparents' duplex on, was it Southeast Morrison Street?
Yeah.
Yeah, a home they built themselves back in the early 60s. And you used it as an example of how working class immigrants influenced the look and even the layout of cities across America, which I found really interesting. But before we dive further into those ideas, I was just curious, is their house still standing?
Yeah, it's still there.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I took my kids to visit it. They were not impressed, but yeah, it looks like a young family is living there. There was like chalk drawings on the sidewalk and everything.
Oh, that's so cool. Is it still a duplex?
Yeah, I believe so.
And you grew up in Portland, right?
Yeah, I did.
Like, which neighborhood did you grow up in?
I grew up in Southwest Portland, like right above, I think they call it PG&E Park. When I was a kid, it was Civic Stadium, but like where the Vista Bridge is up there.
Oh, gotcha. Well, how have things changed in town since you were a kid? Are you seeing us move like in the right direction housing-wise?
I mean, that's a complicated question. So, I mean, both my parents grew up in Portland, so, pretty deep roots, I guess, in the city. And when I was a kid, I mean, Portland was a pretty, working class, middle class city. My dad grew up in Southeast Portland, in my grandparents' house, and he always had a chip on his shoulder about the East Side not getting its due compared to the West Side. I think that there has been a lot of positive changes. I think COVID has been really trying time for the city, but I think some recent policies in terms of allowing a greater diversity of housing is some of the most forward-thinking policy in the country. And yeah, seeing a lot of really interesting missing middle, 2 to 6 unit developments happening, which I think is pretty exciting.
Well, I really enjoyed reading through your book and gaining a new perspective on American history by the prominent styles of cities' architecture and layouts. Like, you were really able to put into words and context many things that I think a lot of us have noticed, but maybe never understood the history of, like how they came to be. And you used Portland specifically to describe the progressive city era. Now, before we jump into explaining how the ubiquitous Portland Bungalow fits into all of this, could you share how the push for single-family homes as the desired dwelling came to be in the 19th century? Just for those who didn't take urban planning, because I found that bit really, really fascinating, and it was a concept I hadn't really explored before.
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's always been this tension in the country between this ideal of, people living in detached single family homes with a big plot of land and the reality of people living in, much denser conditions in cities. And in the United States, this really goes back to the founding of Philadelphia. You have William Penn, who's really this Quaker radical in England. He was actually thrown into the Tower of London for, being subversive. But because of his father, a debt owed to him, he's given this big plot of land in the colonies. And he wants to create this city that's sort of this refutation of the ones he had known back in Europe. And he was just coming off the Great Fire of London, where he saw this very compact medieval city,
Hmm.
literally combust into flames. And so he lays out Philadelphia as what he calls a green country town. And every lot was this large quarter acre lot where it was meant to have this detached house surrounded by a garden. And so that's sort of this ideal kind of embedded deep into the founding of our country,
Hmm.
that has persisted. But the reality is that, Penn's uh, colony was very successful, and Philadelphia becomes sort of the lead city of the country. But instead of sprawling onto these lots, people really compress next to the Delaware River and create these very compact, 10 by 10-foot lots in some cases, and build row houses.
Yeah, but then there was this push to go back to that lot because, yes, as you stated, people were just like, so we don't have cars. We all need to walk everywhere. We're going to live here very closely. And it kind of went back to that idea of just very close, dense urban housing. And then there was a point in the late 19th century where they're just like, yeah, so that's gross. Let's go back to this lot formation. And I feel like that's where we're at, that's landed us now, where we're just like, wow, housing is really expensive. And so I'm just like trying to figure out like what it was that like got us from like point A to point B back to point A. You know what I mean? Like what was
Yeah.
that?
Well, I think that's really a battle that's been waged ever since that point.
Hmm.
And I think it really has to do with competing cultural values. So, we have cities that are by and large, especially by the 19th century, immigrants are their children. But then we have sort of the bulk of the US population and the elite who are Protestant, descended from, Northern European colonialists. And that's really where we see that push for the single family house. And then that by the 20s gets codified in zoning and building codes. And then by after World War II, we have all this federal intervention in housing and sort of federally backed loans that then mandates, houses can only be on a minimum lot size, can only have a certain look. And so we've essentially taken this ideal that goes back to William Penn and reformers in the 19th century and made it our housing policy.
Yeah, which is so many years ago, but it also makes sense where we're at, because you might be aware that Portland is going through a very painful housing crisis, both in unsheltered homelessness, but also just like in the lack of affordable and desirable housing. Now, I know I'm taking a lot of liberties summarizing your thesis, but is it fair to blame Portland's lack of housing on our ubiquitous bungalow style houses?
I think we sort of can blame it on that, to be honest with you. And
Care to expand?
so Portland sort of represents this new era in housing with the bungalow,
Hmm.
which is really sort of the first modern housing type. Because before the bungalow, the vast majority of Americans, whether they lived in a city or in a rural area, lived in a 2 to 3 bedroom house where the rooms were basically interchangeable. You could have a bed right next to an oven and a sink,
Hmm.
where you're like hosting a dinner party. That might be the only thing defining like a kitchen. And the bathroom, would be located in an outhouse or in the basement. And with the bungalow, we get rooms for particular purposes. So we get, living room, we get bedrooms, we get the kitchen and the bathroom brought inside the house. And they also have all of this new technology. So something that I refer to as the holy trinity of the porcelain sink, bathtub, and toilet. These are now in the house. And with that, we have these new lot types. So instead of a 25 by 100 lot where you might have a row house or small apartment building, 50 by 100 with a single family house on it. And Portland really booms in the early 20th century with the streetcar that's allowing people to move out of central cities and live in sort of more sprawling neighborhoods, and also the bungalow. And that becomes sort of the ubiquitous housing type of Portland. And I think also kind of comes to encapsulate an ideal, right?
Hmm.
Like Portland is defined by these leafy green neighborhoods, a slower paced lifestyle where you could live in a bungalow instead of an apartment, where you could focus on your hobbies. And that sort of identification of building types with a certain lifestyle, with a certain aesthetic, I think, is one of the things making it very difficult to build new housing types or denser housing types. Because it's
Yeah.
like, if we get rid of this bungalow, are we getting rid of the identity of the city?
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, well, let's take a quick break here, and when we return, what Portland might have to give up in order to get past our housing crisis. Putting together estate plans for yourself or a family member can be one of the most difficult and frankly not fun things to do as an adult. But Ardent Estate Sales and their team of experts can at least make the selling part of it a lot less stressful. With over a decade of experience in the industry, Angela and her team takes great care to ensure that the entire process of organizing your estate sale is seamless. From pricing to staging, advertising, down to managing the sales, Angela is licensed, bonded, and insured, and she works hard to get everything right, creating the best and most profitable outcomes for her clients. Ardent Estate Sales brings a designer's eye to every setup. From artful displays to thoughtful arrangements, they're designing an inviting atmosphere that highlights value and tells a story, your story. To learn more and book a consultation, head to ardentestatesales.com. That's ardentestatesales.com. If you're a home DIYer like me, you might have a few leftover paint cans gathering dust in your basement. Or maybe your house already came with a bunch of them like mine did. So I'm happy to share that Paint Care makes recycling your leftover paint, stain, and varnish simple and easy with convenient drop-off locations as close as your local hardware store. Paint Care has 3 simple rules for painting smarter. 1, buy the right amount of paint for the job. 2, use up leftover paint. And 3, recycle the rest. If you visit paintcare.org/3 simple rules, you'll find tips on how to do all 3. Buying the right amount of paint for your project, exploring DIY ideas for how to use up leftover paint, and also just look up the nearest drop-off site in your neighborhood. Paint Care is all about keeping it simple for Oregonians. It's very obvious that we need to move on from certain ideals of what Portland is, you know? Is there anything Portlanders might have to let go identity-wise as a city to grow into more sustainable and equitable places to live? Are you saying the thing we have to let go of is leafy greens and bungalows? Because that just sounds awful, Max. Like, I don't want to let go of leafy greens and bungalows. Is there anything else we can give up, like Lent? Like, can we just stop drinking coffee? Like, I'll give up coffee.
Well, I think we don't need to give up the leafy green, but just taking a step back from like the physical qualities of buildings, I think one thing that people appreciate about their neighborhoods and their cities isn't so much the built environment, but the social environment.
Right.
And the people living there. And I feel like, especially a city like Portland, one thing that people love about it is it was sort of this affordable place on the West Coast where people could come and they could open up, a funky restaurant or create a band. And it was, accessible in ways that other places weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we take that back farther to my grandparents and what we're talking about before, Portland used to be a place where, you're a poor immigrant from Eastern Europe, you can come live right in the central city and move into an East Side neighborhood, maybe build your own house and, ascend the economic ladder. So I think building more and denser housing is actually a way to preserve those qualities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Making sure the city stays affordable and not like San Francisco or Los Angeles or other places where they're essentially inaccessible to a whole bracket of the population. But one thing I really want to make clear in this book is we sort of have this binary of housing, right? Is, you either have this leafy green bungalow or you have this huge slab-like apartment complex. But historically, we've really excelled at building dense housing in this country, that is light-filled, that has greenery. And even in Portland, there's examples of that. You can walk down a street and see a duplex or a bungalow court. And there's buildings that retain a low scale, but are much denser than a single family home on a 50 by 100 foot lot. And I think that's sort of what we need to lean into. But that's sort of exactly the type of housing that a lot of our zoning codes in America restrict. One of the cities I highlight is Boston, where you have people moving out of central Boston, moving into the suburbs, and building these buildings called three deckers, which I think is an amazing example of a dense building that combines air and light. It's essentially three apartments stacked on top of each other. Each apartment is the entire floor, so it has air and light on all four sides.
Mm.
And then it has a porch on either side, so it has sort of outdoor space. And it's buffered, from surrounding buildings by sort of a strip of green space. And it looks, they're often clad in wood and they look, sort of a similar aesthetic to a single family home. And they were also, accessible to a broad swath of the population because essentially, a working class person would buy one of these, live in one of the units, and then use the rent from those other two units to pay down his mortgage. And often he would rent those other two units from, other immigrant families or to his own direct family. And that movement of, immigrants, people of color into these buildings was really seen by a threat by more affluent people in the suburbs. And that's really where we get this proliferation of zoning laws that explicitly ban those small multi-unit buildings.
Oh, Max, say that louder. Isn't it funny how, like, when we kind of dig down into all the reasons why we're unhappy, it sometimes always falls into just classism and racism. And you're just like, man.
Yeah. It's, never fails as an explanation for lots of policy choices in this country, unfortunately.
But I always, for some reason, gain so much pleasure from hearing a white man say it back to me. Max, if I were going to give you the task of fixing Portland's housing crisis, the lack of it specifically, like, what would you suggest as our next moves?
I would say in general, and this could apply to a lot of places, is, allowing more of that missing middle housing on single family lots, which Portland is doing. Encouraging denser housing in central cities and on transportation arteries, with which Portland is doing. I'm not a person that believes like the market can solve the housing crisis. I think it's too far gone in a lot of places. So I think you need more explicit government policies. I think you need strong renter protections. I think, rent control is very important just to make sure that working class people can stay in their houses. And then, I think social housing is an important tool we have to look at. I mean, one of the interesting things writing this book is it's like the lack of trust in the government. Even if we go to a place like Canada, the government is sort of allowed to be much more entrepreneurial and very involved in sort of land use and actually physically building things. And I think for us to actually accomplish something like social housing, we have to give the government a lot more liberty to construct housing. We have the right that doesn't trust the government. They want the government sort of out of the market to, let everything happen. But even on the left, there's sort of a lot of mistrust in the government. And I think if, for something like social housing to be successful, that's like a direct intervention of the government in the housing market, where they have to have liberty to build housing on a piece of land and recoup money from that. And I think that's, if you look at places like Vienna or Singapore or lots of these countries, that's sort of a mechanism that they've used to, solve the housing crisis, is create lots of housing and sort of have it be off the market.
Yeah. But I think what people end up worrying about is the ghettoization of certain areas,
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if we're talking about real social housing, it's economically integrated, right? So you have very wealthy people living there. And that's another thing, right, that people might not like, even on the left, right, is you use that luxury housing and that high cost housing to sort of subsidize the rest of it.
Yeah, I feel like Portland really is trying to do that, but it's unfortunately sometimes at the hands of out of state developers, and sometimes we're not getting the best out of that deal, if that makes sense. Like, they're building a bunch of stuff that people don't want to live in,
Exactly.
Just because they're just like filling in the box and they're just like, well, okay, let's crunch the numbers. What's the most amount of money and the least amount of things I have to do? And that's unfortunately the bummer that's happening right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like I missed an easy opportunity to pitch sort of the overall thesis of my book, which is
Go ahead, Max, go for it.
I mean, the housing crisis isn't exclusive to Portland. It's, nationwide, and even, not even happening in, large coastal cities. And there's all this hand-wringing, right, about how do we solve it? What are we going to do? And one of the things I'm trying to draw attention to is this country has this really rich tradition of dense urban housing that wasn't just built for working class people, that was built by working class people, like my grandparents. And in that sort of represented this economic stepping stone. And I think we have to look back and revisit these buildings and make it possible to build them once again. And that economic point, I think, is very important because in that binary that we've created of detached single family homes or the very large apartment buildings, we basically cut out this whole, subset of smaller mom and pop developers where instead of relying on this huge, conglomerate to build your housing, you could build a 2 to 3 unit building on your own, on your lot, rent a space out maybe to your son-in-law, to a student that, wants to come in. And that's a way of, building some economic stability.
I wish that I could like frame what you just said. Do you know how hard it is for just a regular person who's not a developer to do that now? They make it nearly impossible because it's just like not made for us. It's
Yeah.
made, I have to be like a 3 last name company to even get looked at for any kind of assistance. And then if you want to do it on your own, it's just like, well, here's a 10% loan. And you're like, no, that doesn't even make sense.
Yeah. And that's been really interesting is, we've had all these laws that, have allowed accessory dwelling units, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are doing that. And that's kind of like reviving some of that like small mom and pop developer. But then, yeah, in other cases, you can actually build more than that. But sort of those financial tools haven't caught up to make it a reality.
Exactly.
And that's, for going back, looking historically, we had these small savings and loans that were often neighborhood based or immigrant based, and they made it easier for, working class people to take one of those loans and build housing. And we sort of haven't created a replacement for that. And as we sort of hopefully make it easier to build different housing types, that's something we really need to address.
Yeah. Well, these are great ideas. And also just like straight up, like your book was really, really interesting, really fun read. I'll for sure link it into our show notes. I really appreciated this conversation, Max.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's all for today here on CityCast Portland. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more from around the city. Until then, see you at Slim's.